So welcome everyone, welcome to my talk. My name is Dhaval Vyas. I am from University of Queensland. I'm a senior lecturer there. I'm also ARC DECRA Fellow, which is a prestigious fellowship within Australia. This is where Australian Research Council sort of offers fellowship for 3 years to people who are early career researchers. And I got that award last year, and that sort of works with me for the next 3 years. So first of all, I want to tell you that I'm really excited to be here in Sri Lanka because I've been working with Sri Lankan colleagues for last 3-4 years. We have a joint supervision for a PhD student who has now finished his PhD, and there were other side of the supervisors were based in Sri Lanka. So it sort of gives me a great pleasure to sort of talk about the work that I've done that is based around Sri Lankan context while being in Sri Lanka. So this is sort of a great opportunity for me. And with that, I also want to sort of thank the organizers to sort of for arranging my visit here. The title of my talk is Grounded Design, an approach to design with underserved communities. So this is where I sort of, in the last 10-15 years, I've been working on designing and sort of adapting a design approach, which I call grounded design. In today's talk, I'm going to sort of describe that design approach and then give some examples, some case studies through which we can understand this kind of design approach more thoroughly. But sort of in a nutshell, grounded design is more like designing technologies by taking users and your participants' perspective into account, rather than thinking of a technology first and then thinking about how it can solve some problems, right? So this is why it's called grounded, in a sense that it's grounded on people's needs, their requirements, their desires, and based on that you actually design and develop new technologies. So that's what I mean by grounded design. The important word in my title, in my sort of speech title, is the word with. So this is where I'm sort of suggesting that quite often we think about users as subjects, as information providers, right? But with this kind of approach, we conceptualize users or participants as equal partners, as people who are actually contributing alongside with you rather than being just one of the stakeholders. So that's another sort of a thing that I'm going to introduce in my talk. Other thing I wanted to say is that throughout the day you've sort of heard different kind of talks around computer science, right? And we had machine learning, AI, natural language processing, and all the sort of advanced concepts that you can think of. But today, in my talk, I'm going to talk about design. So this is more about focus on human-centered design, human-computer interaction. So this is a slightly different flavor compared to the talks that you've heard so far. And it's sort of that's what makes this conference a bit more interesting, in a sense that you are not just looking at computer science from one particular discipline. You are also looking at it from a different perspective. So today I'm going to give you a perspective from human-computer interaction. Now, I'm well aware that you guys are from traditional computer science, and based on the talks that I've seen, it might sound like this talk might be slightly sort of disjointed with an overall theme. But because of that, what I think is that I want to sort of propose some provocations to you. So this is where I'm going to give you some initial ideas, some questions that you can sort of think about and ponder upon and see how those kind of questions or research ideas you can actually apply in your own research project, right? So these questions are: what is the role of end user in design and development of ICT, right? So end user is important. Can technology empower people? Can it bring positive impact in people's lives, right? Can technology change people's social class and social status? I mean, lots of class and status are quite deeply rooted into our culture, right? So can technology actually play a role to sort of make changes in that order? So that's what sort of, these are the kind of questions I want to propose to you, and sort of think about whether your work is actually trying to address these issues that I'm proposing. Can we conceptualize technology that offers features beyond efficiency and productivity, right? So can we think about user experience? Can we think about product experience, right? So these are important things in human-computer interaction, and I want you to sort of think about how your work can actually, if you ask this question to your own research, how will you sort of fare in that sense? So there are just some provocations that I wanted to start with. I also sort of wanted to give a little bit more detail around my work and my academic career. So as I mentioned, senior lecturer in computer science at University of Queensland. My main research area is human-computer interaction. I teach courses on interaction design, design thinking, as well as advanced human-computer interaction. I've taught courses where there are nearly 300 students sitting in one large auditorium, to where courses that run for a week only. So very intensive courses from 9 to 5, all the 5 days, and then you are done with the course. So I've sort of also run courses in that kind of format. As I mentioned, I'm Australian Research Council's DECRA fellow. My education, I've done my master's in computer science from Lancaster University in the UK, and a PhD from University of Twente. I've had my sort of fair share of experience in industry as well. So before coming to Australia, which was 5-6 years ago, I was a senior research scientist at ABB Corporate Research. Before that, I was a researcher at Nokia Research Center. So I've had sort of fair share of experience of working in the industry as well. And before that, I had sort of done some internship in the companies. So that way, I'm sort of bringing a perspective both from academia as well as from industry. I was quite fortunate to have worked on European Union projects. So European Union projects are really sort of quite nicely funded, nearly 20 million euros, and there are multiple research partners across different European countries. So this is where I have sort of learned quite a lot from the senior colleagues and so on. So I think sort of I've had really fortunate experience in those years. I've also sort of received competitive research grants, over 500,000 Ks in Australian dollars, and there are also sort of ongoing applications through which I'm sort of hoping to get more money. But I'm sort of, my main sort of research sort of focus is to get research grant and then fund my own research through that, right? And just to sort of talk about my research program, so the kind of research I do. So as you can see, my main focus is the designing for underserved community, designing for or designing with underserved community. And this is where I focus on designing ICT tools for community care centers, refugees and asylum seekers, women who've had domestic violence or who've had other kind of crises, financially sort of struggling older adults, and resource-constrained maker organizations. So this is where, this is what I mean by working with underserved communities. So communities where actually there is a requirement, there is actual need to sort of help them out and make sure that they can actually, they can sort of improve their lives, they can improve their working habits and so on. But with that, I also have focus on activity monitoring and health informatics using mobile devices. So I have some ongoing projects related to workplace-based activity tracking, sleep tracking, but I'm obviously not going to talk about those things in my current presentation. There's also a nice little research area that we sort of came up with called human-money interaction. So how we can engage with our own money in a better way through the use of technology. Right? So I'm obviously not going to talk about that. So what does it mean to engage and interact with underserved communities? So there are three main propositions that I have to when you are sort of that you should take into account when you are engaging with underserved communities. One of the first points that you should keep in mind is that you are sort of not just designing for these communities, you are designing with these communities. So this is where you are sort of not treating these participants as subjects or just like information providers, but they are actually with you throughout the course of design and development process. And I'm going to talk about these activities in my project as well. The second point that I want to make is that when you are engaging with underserved communities, you want to sort of move away from deficit model to more empowering model. So deficit model would be something that is lacking in a community and you are trying to fix that. Or there's some problem, then you are trying to fix that. So more like problem-solving way of doing things. But what we have learned is that when you are working with underserved communities, it's sort of more important to work or focus on issues that are already working nicely. So positive issues, issues that are that people already have strengths, right? So this is because when you focus on deficit models or when you focus on problems, you actually exacerbate those problems. But when you focus on their strengths, you are actually sort of trying to empower them, but also sort of using technology or designing new technologies, you are actually strengthening those existing capabilities and existing strengths, right? So this is where there has to be sort of a focus such as this, where you are actually looking at these communities and this kind of people from more sort of empowering viewpoint. The third thing that I want to propose is that when you are engaging with underserved communities, you want to sort of think about ethics. You want to think about long-term engagement with this kind of communities. Because when you are engaging with this type of communities, you are looking at sort of power distance that comes in when you actually go into those communities. So they see you as somebody who's an expert in the field, somebody who's sort of well educated, and there's already sort of power bias that comes into that process. So you need to sort of think about how you can conduct research more ethically, where you are not just being transparent, but also being very, very sort of ethical in terms of the conduct that you're doing. The other point that I want to make is that when you are engaging with underserved communities, you want to make sure that you have long-term engagement, and it's not just like you are sort of only sort of engaging with them to either evaluate a technology or sort of learn about certain behaviors of the community. You want to make sure that you have a quite long-term engagement with that, and I think in the two cases that I have prepared today, all these three sort of propositions I'm trying to sort of include in my talk. So with that, let's introduce what grounded design is, right? Now, is there anybody who knows what user-centered design is? User-centered design? Anybody has heard that term? Okay, so there's one person there. So user-centered design is typically where you try and understand a particular context or a particular community or a set of users, and based on that understanding, you then try and implement something. So whatever you implemented or whatever you designed, it actually sort of fulfills the needs of the people who are going to actually use it, right? So in grounded design, you start with understanding a particular context or a particular setting, and this is where you use approaches like ethnography, approaches like in situ. So you go to the people's context and then try and understand what they need and what their problems are, what their value, what their practices are. So going into people's context will actually inform you quite a bit about what actually needs to be designed, right? So second phase is called co-designing. So this is where you actually engage the same community, the same users, into a design process through which you can actually sort of think about design solutions that will actually work for the same community. So you are involving the participants that you are actually designing for in the design process, and through which you are actually enriching your process, because these people are the ones who are going to use that product or that particular design idea, right? So by involving them, you are actually doing yourself a favor by making sure that you are sort of catering to the needs of those participants. And the third phase is assessing. So this is where you, whatever you have designed, which is based on understanding and code designing phase, you then fully implement it and give it back to your communities or participants. So this is where your group of community members are actually going to use the application that you have designed, and they will sort of share how that application has actually improved their lives, and how that application has actually played a positive role or a negative role in their everyday work activities. So giving this application out in people's natural context and natural environment is another thing that you want to make sure that you get rich insights and rich data from your participants. Now, with that, I want to sort of start talking about the two cases that through which I want to sort of elaborate on the on the idea of grounded design. So the first case is from Australia. So this is where we engage with a community care center called Communify Queensland. And this is where we have actually designed a technology through which we sort of increased engagement of the community member. And the second application that I'm going to talk about is actually is done by somebody who is from this university, Trilina Halaluwa. And this is where we are going to sort of, I'm going to talk through that project where a new microfinance application was designed for rural Sri Lankan community. Right, so let's start with the first case that is based in Australia. So Communify Queensland, this is the, this is the image that is from the community care center itself. Now in Australia, there are multiple community care centers. This is where people who are from low socioeconomic background, people who are struggling financially, they will go there and get financial help or emergency food relief or other kind of support from this organization. Obviously, this is, we are talking about a Western country, and this is where, people who are struggling financially can come to this kind of sort of community care center and get help from them, right? So this is like a very typical work day for the community care center. There are people sitting on the right-hand side. They are waiting for their turns, and here there are volunteers with the lanyards. They're actually helping individual clients get the right kind of food that they want for their weekly ration. Right? There are also sort of clothes, old clothes that people can get by visiting this kind of community care center. So it's basically a place where people can get help, people can get support from others. This particular place is called the pantry. So this is where the emergency food relief is being offered. And one of the things that we wanted to do here was to sort of see how we can increase engagement within this community. Because quite often we saw that people who are struggling financially, especially in the Western countries, they develop stigmas and they develop sort of some sort of stereotypes around themselves, and there is sort of mental health issues there as well. So people sort of tend to become lonely or tend to sort of engage less and less throughout their life. So they also wanted to sort of see this from a health perspective and make sure that whatever we design actually sort of caters to their positive health as well, right? So our research question, and as I mentioned before, that we wanted to look at the positive side of it. We wanted to look at the empowering side of people rather than deficit side. So our research question was, how do people live well on low or no income, and what role can technology play in it? So this is where we are actually focusing on the positive aspects of people's lives. So what actually is working right now? How are they practicing, how are they making sure that even with low or no income, they are living well? So we are looking at this problem from a positive perspective, right? So now what I'm going to do is that I'm going to apply the framework of grounded design in this particular setting, and then we'll go through the 3 different phases and see what sort of design ideas and implementation we came up with. So the first phase was about understanding, right? So this is where we first wanted to understand what are the people like, what is the setting like, what sort of practices are in place, what sort of problems people face. But at the same time, we obviously, as I mentioned, we wanted to find out how are they actually living well, how are they sort of having these positive practices around their lives. So having that kind of mindset, we sort of used field visits, interviews, and video documentary as an approach to understand how currently the people are sort of practicing their everyday activities. So in field visits, we'll go and visit the pantry, the community care center, and we'll sort of try and observe and talk to people to find out how are they living their everyday lives. We also sort of asked certain participants to have an opportunity for an interview. So we visited their houses and sort of done like proper study around how are they actually living well, how are they organizing their finances, how are they sort of doing their social activities, so to get a broader perspective around their everyday activities. And the third method that we use is called video documentary. So this is where we gave a set of video cameras to our participants, and we asked them to create their own documentary about their own life. Right? So I'm going to talk about that particular method in the next couple of slides. So based on all these methods that we applied, we got quite a lot of qualitative data. So this is qualitative research, right? So this is where we got lots of photos, lots of audio recorded interviews, we got lots of video footages from our participants, and then we analyzed the data using qualitative data analysis methods. And what we found is we found resilient behaviors from participants. So even though they were from low socioeconomic background and struggling financially, they still had lots of resilient practices in place through which they actually enhanced their lifestyle. Right? So what we saw was that there were resilient was being practiced at individual level as well as group level. So in individual level, people were sort of, it was quite sort of inherent into their everyday practice to make sure that they would live economically. So they would go for second-hand shops to buy things. They would go to cheap shops to get their rations. They will also sort of make sure that they will go to the organizations where they can get free food and free sort of services. So they sort of made sure that they use all these resources that can actually help them. But at the same time, we also saw that there was a social element to it. So this is where we found that people actually helped each other out who were in a similar kind of situation. So they sort of, when they are buying something, they would carpool and make sure that that's something, they will sort of share cost. Now, in certain countries and certain sort of developing countries, that's a common thing to sort of, carpool and then buy things. But in a Western country, that's a sort of slightly different kind of practice, because normally you would not expect that to happen in a developed country. But because they were from low socioeconomic background, they wanted to make sure that they utilize all their opportunities in a right way. They would also sort of share Wi-Fi with their next door neighbors, so through which they can actually maximize their sharing resources, but at the same time minimize the expenses as well. So if you wanted to sort of read on this particular study, there's a paper there that you can read. But I want to sort of point out one particular example. So this is where we interviewed a 75-year-old person who was one of our participants, and he actually was struggling with one of the government departments. So the government actually closed the entrance to his own house because of certain road constructions and so on. So he wanted to fight the case with the government. And this is where, even being like an old age person, he went to different libraries because he did not own a computer. So he went to different libraries where he actually used Google's SketchUp, which is a nice modeling tool that you can use. And he created his own models of the house and proposed new ways through which government can actually sort of help him by sort of opening the access to his own house. So he sort of, this way he showed a resilient practice through which he sort of learned a completely new tools, go around different libraries, and through which he sort of prepared his own report, which actually he used to fight the case against the government. So it's sort of, we looked at all these kind of resilient practices through which people, our participants sort of showed resilience. Now, the other study that we did in this particular project is called video documentaries. So this is where we actually gave a video camera, a portable video camera like this, and we also sort of attached a set of tasks for the participant. So we obviously wanted to keep it open-ended. So we wanted to make sure that the participant has this opportunity to sort of make a documentary in his or her own way. So we didn't want to sort of influence too much, but we still wanted to give some pointers that they can consider. By no means it was a must-do, but we still thought that it might actually help them to think about certain things about their lifestyle. So we give them this instruction sheets with some set of pointers that they can apply, and then at the end we got quite a lot of data from our participants. Don't know what's wrong. Yeah. So, and once we collected all the data from our participant, we also did a final interview with the participant to find out if there were any kind of misunderstanding that we might have through the data. So we clarified those things by having an interview with them at the end. So this method, I want to sort of just give you a quick flavor of what kind of data that we collected from it. So obviously the video quality is not great because this was a portable camera and the work was done a couple of years ago. So at that time there was sort of, not, portable cameras were not sort of that high res. But just to sort of protect the identity of our participant, we sort of blurred their faces so that it's sort of that's an ethical way of conducting research. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to play this video. It's a very long video, but I'm going to sort of cut in like 5 minutes time because we obviously want to move on to the other things. But this is where you will sort of see different footages from different participants and what kind of things they tried to capture in the video documentary that they created. So there is an audio here.
Over 60, and I live at Hawthorne.
Start from the beginning.
And I live at Hawthorne in a Department of Housing flat that is for older people over 60. 2.5 years ago, my dog was shot and killed by my next door neighbour, and I rang the police to report this, and they come out the next day and arrested me for something that I didn't do 15 years ago. It was their paperwork that they messed up, but it still didn't, the charges have since been all withdrawn, but I still had to spend 4.5 months in jail.
My health has deteriorated quite remarkably. I receive $47.60 by Centrelink per fortnight, not enough to feed a dog. Communify came to my rescue and provided me with food and essentials. I had lost 11 kilograms in weight. I was forced to sell my house to pay my debts. Technically and legally, I was homeless. I moved into a derelict house, no water, no gas, no electricity, no sewage. By his kindness, the next door neighbour put a 240-volt lead across the fence to run my refrigerator.
Good morning, it's Saturday, it's coffee time again. Another doctor's appointment today. That's at 10 o'clock. It's a bit after 8 o'clock now. Obviously doing the regular thing, watching the TV, the idiot box. And appearing live again.
Charcoal. Come as a beautiful bonus.
Participants also showed what sort of activities they did at home, what sort of projects they had ongoing at home. And this is all recorded by the participants, so we weren't there to help them out. So this is something that they created to represent their lifestyle, their problems, and their sort of ongoing nice projects that they wanted to sort of showcase.
What we end up with is a beautiful combination of charcoal and ash, which can now go onto the garden. It's an incredible fertiliser, the soil enhancer. So this goes all around the garden to grow all the bananas and pawpaws, and it'll go into the veggie beds.
So I'll not play sort of any further than this, but the point here, the main point here is that we sort of gave the agency to the participants themselves. So we didn't we obviously asked them questions, but we sort of left the whole research onto them to sort of find out, to sort of tell us what sort of issues and problems that they are facing. Because quite often when we ask questions, we already have certain assumptions in our head, right? But when we actually leave it to them to sort of think about and sort of prepare a documentary about themselves, this is where they sort of focus on the issues that are quite pertinent to their lifestyles, right? So that was the first phase where we sort of try and understand the actual activities and problems that our participants were facing. In the second phase of the project, we sort of then thought about how we can sort of convert all those findings into design ideas. Right, so because we are obviously not social science researchers, we are human-computer interaction researchers, and we obviously want to design new technologies through which we can actually sort of solve or sort of enhance people's lifestyle. Right, so what we did was to in the same pantry, in the same community center, we organized a set of workshops, a design workshops. So this is where we invited these people to sort of come up with ideas through which they can actually increase their engagement. We also asked them to come think about technologies that can actually help them in their everyday lives. So we actually sort of got them together in groups and then asked them to sort of brainstorm about what kind of new technologies will actually help in their everyday life, right? So this is where you can actually see me moderating a session, and one of the participants is actually presenting a design idea that we asked them to sort of think about. Obviously, these community members are not designers, so they cannot tell you the exact solution that they want. But in the discussion, in the process of sort of involving them in the design process, we learn quite a lot about their requirements as well. So the two main things that we found through this design activity was to sort of that participants wanted to sort of make connection with each other, because as I mentioned, a lot of people had stigmas and they were sort of struggling with loneliness, so they were not talking to each other. But they sort of in the sessions we found out that there was actually a need, or they actually desired to have connections and have sort of discussions with others. And they also wanted to sort of share their stories, share their experiences of good and bad both, and sort of inform others on how they can sort of live well on a low income, right? So these were the sort of initial findings that we had from our design workshops. And one of the potential idea that we had from this was to think about a storytelling application in the community care center itself, right? So we then designed a storytelling application called StoryMate. And it's a very simple application. What it does is that it lets participants to sort of upload photos and write text around those photos through which they can actually share their experiences or tell stories, right? We knew that there were lots of participants who were not who were not sort of tech savvy, who would not have a computer, or who would not be able to sort of do typing for a longer period. So we also had this feature through which they can just sort of take up a headphone and then start telling story, and then the system will actually record their whole story as well. So this is where we sort of thought about supporting multimodal interaction. We had support for photos, we had support for textual stories, but at the same time they can also sort of upload or they can tell verbal story verbally as well. We also sort of have, so what we did was that we created a kiosk-like sort of design for the system. There were instructions attached to it, and we also placed volunteers, student volunteers, to sort of help some participants out who might actually struggle interacting with a system like that. And we placed this in the pantry session itself. There was a web version of the application as well, so people who were tech savvy, who were sort of able to use internet and sort of take photos and upload those photos and write some textual stories. For them, the web version actually played a very nice role through which they can actually sort of take their own time to write and build the stories. But others who did not have computers or just had like phone, for them it was sort of easier to just come to the community care center, listen to the stories from others, and then at the same time sort of share and sort of exchange ideas with others using the storytelling application. What we then did was to sort of run an in situ sort of field trial. So this is where we are in phase 3 of assessing. So we wanted to sort of find out to what extent we actually helped out our participants or the community that we were trying to sort of help. So we, as I said, we sort of brought in these technologies in the center itself. We showed demos, we showed them how they can use this kind of application, and we recruited 20 clients of Communify. So this is where 20 participants said, yes, we are happy to participate in your study. So we then sort of recruited them and then asked them to sort of use this application where and when they would like to use. So we did not force them to actually sort of use it, but we wanted to sort of find out whether something like this would actually help their everyday interaction. And again, we wanted to sort of check this out not just in a one particular session. We wanted to trial this out for over a longer period. So for 2 months, we placed this application in the community care center, and then we sort of saw how people actually engaged and interacted with this kind of stories. So as I mentioned, we had some capstone students here to help us out. And what we found was that they were like, in the period of 2 months, we had 104 stories being told or being shared through the use of system. These stories, some of the stories were inspirational in nature, so they were more about sort of telling, sharing experiences that had some sort of message in it, some sort of inspiration or some sort of motivation in it, through which they can actually encourage others to sort of go through this kind of lifestyle, and then make sure that they sort of don't give up on such a bad situation. But there were also sort of stories around tips and sort of advising others on how to live well. So there were stories around some homemade remedies, so like economical ways of living, right? So there were stories that would help others to sort of survive nicely. There were also stories about food, because the pantry itself was a place where they would get free food, right? So there were lots of stories around recipes and sort of how to cook food from the pantry that they are visiting. So this is one of the sort of stories that we got, which is basically a recipe that one of the participants shared. She had diabetes, so she wanted to make sure that she gives a recipe that has sugar-free banana, through which people can make sugar-free banana bread, right? So using stories like this, they sort of initiated conversation, communication, and sort of engagement within the community. You will see that there are some comments at the end. So through these comments, people sort of started engaging, but when they actually met physically, they would sort of start talking to each other and engage further. So through this application, we actually sort of increased this kind of social engagement within the community. We also sort of wanted to see, like, what are the larger impact of something like this in a community. So a lot of people felt that this gave them a voice. So this is where people thought that, look, quite often nobody cares about us, but with this kind of application, we can actually sort of put our voice across to the community, and there are others who will listen to us and then help us out through their comments or their suggestions and so on. So they felt that it was sort of quite therapeutic. So it was sort of contributing towards their positive health in a sense. Lots of people sort of talked about, like, sharing of recipes and how they were going to sort of apply those recipes in their everyday cooking activities. Some of the people also sort of said that they're going to start their own YouTube channel, because some participants had sort of really nice DIY and making projects happening, and they were sort of telling stories around that. But then they thought that using this application, they can also run like YouTube channel through which they can tell their stories with more like videos and so on. So using this kind of application, it sort of encouraged them to sort of take up ICT in a way through which they can actually reach to a larger audience. Right? So we were sort of looking for this kind of impact to make sure that an application like this can actually help people in their social engagement. So that was the first case, and this is just a quick recap that what we did here in the first case was that we first tried to understand the situation, the people's problems, their needs, and so on. Then we did a co-design. So we involved them in the co-design workshops, and through which we came up with new ideas. And in the third phase, we actually did in situ evaluation or in situ assessment of participants actually using our application. So this is where we actually get the realistic feedback on how people are actually engaging with your application, right? So that's sort of a concluding remark for the first case. Now, in the second case, so this is the case where a study was done here in Sri Lanka, in Colombo itself. So this case was about designing a microfinance tool for a rural Sri Lankan community. And obviously, you know, people who live in rural areas where banks might not be around, they might not have sort of access to those financial services. So this is where we sort of, obviously this was a work of Selina Halalua. So what Selina did was that he sort of, he sort of wanted to do a study around how we can sort of understand the existing microfinance activities and what sort of technologies we can design through which we can enhance those existing practices, right? So just some introduction or some sort of background about microfinance. So microfinance is where you do not have direct access to banks or where you do not have the right kind of credit history. You can go to microfinance agencies and they will give you loans as a group of sort of people going together. So they will not give loans to individuals. Now there are sort of agencies microfinance agencies that give sort of loans to individuals, but the microfinance that we engage with, it will only give loans to group of people. So when you are asking for money, you have to go within a group to be able to sort of get some money from the organization. The field site was in Gampaha in Sri Lanka, and the way they would create sort of microfinance center would be like this. And there are some photos of from the center itself. So a center would be somebody's house, you know, somebody who's well reputed, somebody who's sort of financially better off, but you know, who has like large house where he or she can accommodate a lot of people. So a center would be something like this. There is a center leader who probably owns the house, and there are sort of groups of people who have actually taken loans from the microfinance. Every group has a group leader, so you can see group leader there, and then the group leader will coordinate activities within the center, within its own group. But the center leader will obviously will have his own group, but he or she will also sort of organize or maintain the whole sort of microfinance activity in the center itself. Every week or every 2 weeks, a loan officer will come in, and there you can see a loan officer. And then that loan officer will sort of then collect money, because all these people are sort of they've received some loans, and then loan officer will come in every fortnight to get the money repayments from the participants. So this is like typical. This is how the MFIs actually worked. The research question we had in this case was that how can technology empower people in their financial management? Right? So a lot of people here, they were sort of not looking for large amount of money. They were looking for 5,000 Sri Lankan rupees, 10,000 Sri Lankan rupees. So this is like small scale amount that would actually help their local businesses to make sure that they can actually sort of sustain through those kind of small scale activities. So we wanted to sort of see how is the current microfinance ecology in Sri Lanka, especially in Gampaha, and how new technology can actually enhance people's experiences around microfinances. So as I said, we applied the grounded design methodology here, and the first phase was about understanding. So understanding how microfinance is being practiced at the moment. So what we did, so what Selina did was to sort of, he conducted observations, time-structured interviews with participants, and sort of he would sort of individually recruit some members and then do an individual interview after the particular sort of session is over. So he would actually attend those sessions, the microfinance sessions, and then at the end he will recruit and then do the interviews then. So in his study, he had 15 members from the microfinance community who had taken loans, and 4 loan officers. So we tried to get perspective from both sides. So obviously the clients as well as the lenders or the loan officers who would come in and sort of oversee how the loan is being managed. These are the potential, these are the typical participants. So this is a participant who bought a sewing machine from the money that she got from the loan that she got from the microfinance agency. And she sort of, this is where Tilina actually went into the people's people's houses and then interviewed them and sort of tried to understand how are they actually sort of making use of those money, the microfinance money, and how are they actually sort of repaying those amounts. So after the observations and the semi-structured interviews, obviously he had lots of data on his hand, and he sort of, when he analyzed, he sort of saw three main patterns that emerged. So one of the things that he saw was that there was a strong trust and credibility issue that was in place. So microfinance would work only based on trust and credibility, because as I mentioned before, it's sort of, it's a group-based lending. It's not just one person lending the money. It's like 4 or 5 people getting together. So it's important that you are able to trust each other. So if somebody is actually missing a payment, that would actually jeopardize other members' sort of loan-related activities. So they wanted to make sure that they only get trustworthy people in the group, and that way sort of they made made sure that their repayments are on time. Some of the things they took care of by sort of putting influential people at the right place. So the center leader will always be somebody who would have a higher respect in the whole community. Also, the group leader would be somebody who is like either a shop owner or sort of a medical practitioner, that everybody would sort of respect that person. So he or she would have a stronger say in making sure that everybody actually pays their dues on time. So these are like certain strategies that were in place. They also saw that this was an opportunity through which they can actually earn their trust. So quite often some of the participants did not have good credit because of their sort of bad financial situation, but they saw this as an opportunity through which they can actually sort of re-earn that credibility. We also saw that the community itself, so the microfinance center itself actually played quite an important role in making sure that the microfinance activities are performed in a very, very effective way. So some of the center leaders actually asked their participants to actually pay extra, pay in addition to their actual dues. So that way they were sort of creating this buffer money. So if somebody is missing a payment or somebody is struggling financially and did not have a great week of business, then they would actually use the money from this buffer pot to make sure that that person's sort of credibility does not get sort of messed up in the eyes of the loan officer. So they would actually support each other that way. But there were also sort of other kind of practices through which a member would actually loan some money to another member. So this way, sort of, they, obviously they would sometimes they would charge the interest as well. So sometimes there were sort of negative connotations attached to this, where they saw that this was a practice through which they were some of the members were actually making money, right? So while buffer money was a practice through which the community was helping each other out, whereas members as lenders is where members were actually sort of lending money to other members who were sort of who were not paying on time. This is where there were some frictions also came out. We also saw that families actually help each other. They made sure that even though there is one person who has a loan, like other family members would actually help out in the business and in the repayment activities, so that they don't actually default on their repayment. So families actually played a very important role here as well. If you wanted to know a bit more about this work, there is a very nice paper on this in the CSCW conference. I would actually urge you to read that paper. So what we did next, we obviously had lots of data from our participants. We learned how microfinance was being practiced. We found out some issues. We found out some good practices as well. But then we wanted to involve the participants themselves into a design process through which we can come up with new ideas, new design ideas. So what we did was that we sort of invited 17 microfinance clients, the clients who were actually taking money from the microfinance agencies, and we involved them in in a persona creation. So persona is a fictitious user, and we ask them to sort of create a fictitious persona through which they can actually solve their financial problems. So we actually involve them in a kind of a very designerly activity through which they can come up with new ideas for supporting microfinance. Now, again, we knew that these people are not designers. They cannot design the actual technology. But in the design process, in the process of engaging with others on design ideas, we can actually find out lots of important things, lots of sort of inspirational things that we can actually apply in actually designing new tools. So in the workshop, we found that so we asked them to sort of think about a new technology through which they can solve their financial problems. So one of the participants sort of built a cupboard, a magic cupboard, where there is a section where she keeps money there, and her husband would not be able to see that money. So it's obviously an imaginary sort of kind of idea, but this is where we found out that there was a friction within family where wife wanted to sort of hide some money and some money management activities from their husband. So this is where we found that women wanted to have that ability to sort of have control over some of the money that they earned, right? So sort of this particular example sort of told us that particular design requirement, that independence, having an independent control over your money is one of the requirements that our participants had. Another participant, when we asked her to create new design idea, she actually just created a nice cutout of her daughter. And we asked her why she did that. And she said, my life is my daughter. And this is where she's trying to make sure that she has good education and she earns enough money to support her. So this is where we found out that family support and using money to support their families is an important quality for the participants. So these are the sort of findings we got from this kind of creative design workshops. By the way, Thelina got Best Paper Award for this particular paper, so it's sort of a nice achievement for him. Then what we did? We then used those findings in order to design an application, a mobile application that would support microfinance activities. So again, a very simple application. What you see here is that whenever the participant would get some money, they would sort of they would put into different categories. When they are spending money, they would put it into separate categories, and then you can see that all the red things are expenses, all the green things are money coming in. So this is a sort of very simpler way to sort of dividing the money that was coming in and going out. The next screen shows you the repayment amount, loan amount. So what is the overall loan? So 20,000, the interest with the loan, the amount that is paid. So that way they actually sort of saw what is their exact repayment amount every week or every 2 weeks, right? And the third screen shows you a sort of an interactive way through which they can actually showcase whether they are paying things on time or not. So green color would show that they have done full payment on time. Red color would show that they haven't paid. Yellow will show that they have done partial payment, and gray would be something that is like in the future activity. So it's sort of in the future week. So this is a sort of an interface through which they can easily see whether they are skipping payments or whether they're doing payments on time. And sort of it was a very good testimony to just show it to somebody and say, well, look, you are doing good in terms of all the green bits in your sort of weekly performance. So that was a good feature that through which we thought that they can actually oversee whether they are sort of doing payments on time. So this was actually done by the loan officer. So loan officer would actually make sure that they would also sort of provide feedback and sort of add an entry of the participant. And this is the way they can actually sort of inform their participants whether they have actually done the payments on time or not. We also had leaderboard. So leaderboard is a gamified way to sort of showcase whether you are who's on the top. So who hasn't missed any repayments. So this is the way through which we actually encouraged people to sort of pay their dues on time, and they sort of show themselves as, obviously they wanted to be on the top, so that they would actually pay every sort of repayments on time. So through the leaderboard, we encourage people to sort of do the repayments on time. So with this application, what we did was that we recruited 38 users who were actually the clients of the microfinance agency. And we asked them to use this application over 2 months. So again, so we wanted to sort of get longitudinal understanding of how certain application can be used. Every 2 weeks, we actually did experience sampling. So experience sampling is where Thelina would go to the meetings where loan officers are around, and he would actually ask around if there are any problems or questions or anything that they wanted to report about the application itself. So he was sort of continuously collecting data, continuously collecting sort of feedback from the participants over the 2 months. But at the end of the 2 months, he also conducted an interview with individual participants as well. So this is where they got an overall view from the participants about how this kind of application has affected their sort of money management and financial management activities, right? So what we learned. So in this, what we actually learned was that the application increased participants' awareness about their finances, because quite often participants had multiple microfinance loans from different agencies. So what this did was that they actually can then prioritize which loan has more sort of interest, so that they actually wanted to make sure that they would, if they are short of money, they would pay the high interest loan first, and then loans where there are sort of no interest or less interest, they would actually skip those payments. So they were actually more aware of how they can sort of effectively manage their loan repayments. We also saw that the application gave an opportunity for participants to create a new image for themselves, because in the past there were people who did not have a great experience of sort of doing repayments on time. So community itself sort of created a bad image for that particular participant. And what they thought was that by having sort of all the repayments done on time and having all the green sort of thing on their application, all the weekly performance, if it's all green, just like you can see here in the image, it sort of shows that you are actually a good member of the team. It shows that you are paying everything on time, and you are sort of helping out your group as well. We also found out that using this application, the missed payment were lowered. Number of missed payment were lowered by 50%. So that's quite a good achievement, in the sense that because they were sort of more aware about their performance, because they can actually see who's actually doing better than them, they actually got encouraged to make sure that they would do their repayments on time. And sort of the loan officer actually informed us at the end of 2 months that they saw that so there was a reduction in the number of missed repayments. We also saw that there were new practices around microfinance workflow. So we had this leaderboard in our application, but then some of the center leaders actually created their own physical leaderboard. So they would actually sort of create this kind of big board and write down who's number 1 and who's number 2 and so on. And that way would encourage other members to actually pay on time and make sure that they also sort of go towards the top rank. So that was a good thing to see, that our application was actually quite was taken quite seriously, and they wanted to sort of, not just sort of relying on the phone, but they sort of had a big board so that others can see what's happening in the center. We also found out that as an extension of the application, they started giving awards to people who were performing better. So they created this kind of badges to people who are doing everything on time. And here is one of the proud microfinance client who is actually showing her phone with all the green colored sort of weekly performance. So that's where she's actually showcasing that she has done all the payments on time, and that's why she got an award. Award in a sense that she got the badge where she can claim that she is one of the best members in the whole group. So this was like, this is how our application was extended by these participants to sort of to actually internalize these things into their everyday microfinance activities. So these are like the larger impacts of how our application actually helped these participants. Now, so Thelina is actually going to present this paper in 2 days' time, So I'm actually presenting this, like some of the highlights, in advance to you guys. Now this is probably my second last slide. And I'm sort of trying to reflect on what we have learned so far, right? So in the very first or very second slide, I sort of posed some provocative questions around how we can sort of make a sort of positive impact in people's lives, and how we can sort of, can we actually break those social and cultural barriers? Because as you can see in some of the applications that we designed, especially the microfinance application, they actually saw that application as a way through which they can actually improve their image. If they are doing payments on time, they would actually be seen in a sort of in a positive manner within the community. So this is how we sort of enable participants to sort of break these cultural and social barriers. Other thing that I want to sort of reflect on is when we focus on the positive sides of the vulnerable community members, this is where we actually can sort of achieve better outcomes. Because if we try and fix a problem, this is where we actually sort of exacerbate those problems in a different way. So focusing on positives of people's lives actually helped us out. The last point I want to make here is that grounded design approach enables more appropriate design solutions. So if you look at the actual technologies that I've talked about, these are very, very simple applications. They can be designed by anybody, right? But they are actually designed to a particular community by taking their needs and their desires and their everyday activities in account. So this is where we've designed these simple technologies to serve a specific need for the participant, right? But there are still some questions around, did we actually do everything ethically? Did we sort of solve problems related to power distance and so on? So these are some of the things that we are still trying to dig deep into and trying to understand how we can sort of do this kind of research in a bit more ethical way. So with that, I will acknowledge the work that has been, what I've presented so far is there are lots of things that I've learned from my colleagues, my students, and my collaborators. So I want to acknowledge their contribution, and I obviously want to thank you for listening to me after the lunch. And if you have any questions, I'm very happy to answer. Yes. When I yeah, so I guess it's sort of starting from recruitment to sort of inviting them to the design workshop that we conducted, then to sort of coming up with design ideas. I think that there are challenges throughout, but quite often people nobody would like to be acknowledged as somebody who is from a low socioeconomic background or who's struggling financially, because it's sort of it hurts their ego, but at the same time it's sort of it's demeaning to people to say that, look, I'm poor, I'm happy to help you out in your research, right? So we had to sort of do this research in a way through which we actually dignify the participants. And that's why the positivist approach that we use in our work, that we don't look at the problems, we don't ask what's your issue, we actually ask what is working out nicely for you. So this is where we actually look at their positive side, and everybody's happy to talk about their positive experiences, right? So by focusing on those empowering aspects, positive aspects, we actually sort of enable those kind of participation from our community members. So obviously recruiting itself is a challenge. Another sort of big challenge that we see here is that what happens after 2 months of evaluation, right? So this is where we left our technology in the community care center. We left our technology with the microfinance clients. They've used it for 2 months, but what happens afterwards? So that's another thing that, obviously I had a PhD student or I had a capstone student who would actually work during those times, but they also sort of they'll finish and they'll move on, right? So this is another challenge on how we can sort of find champions in the community itself who can then take over our projects and then sort of run them in a longer period, right? So we obviously want to sort of find out how our applications are being used after 2 years, right? So this is where you can actually learn quite a lot of insightful things from your participants, but that's a challenge because, you know, I'm a lecturer, I also have to teach. I can't just do the research all the time, so obviously I'm reliant on students and so on. So I think, you know, to be very realistic, to see how this application can be used in a long run is a huge challenge. So I just sort of listed 2, but I'm sure there are other challenges as well. Any other questions? All right, if you, yeah, please. I use what? Yeah, so I follow the school, you know, qualitative school of thought. I'm interested in finding people's experiences and their stories and so on. I know there are others who would sort of try and quantify and sort of say, you know, this many stories were about say, health, this many stories were about something else. So, you know, you can obviously quantify this further, but for me, it's sort of, you know, more interesting to look at the larger experiences and larger impact that our applications are bringing to the participants, rather than looking at, you know, when you quantify, you sort of reduce their experiences into numbers. And obviously that's good for people who are actually following the quantitative school of thought, and that's fine. But because I follow qualitative school of thought, I'm sort of more interested in stories and examples and so on. So one of the things that we talked about was the video documentary approach, through which we actually sort of get them to talk about their own experiences in the way that they prefer. So we actually did not intervene there. Other methods such as participatory design, where we actually invite them to come to the table and then think about new design ideas. So giving them this kind of opportunities through which they can think outside of the box, right? So this is like, you know, participatory design workshops, and through those methods we actually gather and collect data from our participants. Thanks. Any other questions? All right, I think that's that then. Thank you very much again for listening.